Hey, so welcome to Modifying the Default Pawn Actor. In this video, we'll talk about why Blueprint is helpful. I'll tell you right now, Blueprint is helpful when you are making templates of assets because it's very visual, it's very clear in the editor what you're changing, and you're preventing yourself from hard coding changes in assets into actual C++ code, which means if you want to change the name of an asset, for example, then the editor will track those changes. I'll show you how to make a blueprint from the default pawn. We'll note this blueprint even class inherits from the default pawn. So blueprint class is based on the C++ class. It is an is-a relationship. Blueprint is like a template, as I said before. It's like it sounds. It's a plan for building something. And you can make an instance in the scene of a given blueprint template. We'll be doing that. And we'll explore instantiating from Blueprint, which is exactly what I just said. It's creating an instance, is instantiating, and then modifying the thing that's in the scene and seeing that that doesn't change the blueprint. So the blueprint's a template, basically. So let's dive in and see all this happen. So let's see how we're going to get a handle on this default pawn. Remember that when we start the game and we eject ourselves, the player controller, from the pawn body there it is, that this pawn that's being spawned into the world, which is available in the world outliner here as default pawn 1, is being specified by the game mode under project settings, maps and mode, and then if you go into the detail of the game mode, it's here. It's grayed out because this is a C++ game mode and you'd have to specify this in code. We are going to make a blueprint version so we can specify it here in the editor later, but for now what we want to do is be able to see how we can modify the pawn. So how do we do that? Well, so with the game running, click on your default pawn that has spawned. Go to the blueprints menu and say convert selected actor to blueprint class. Okay, you'll get a name. I'm going to call it default pawn underscore BP for our blueprint default pawn. There you go. That is done. Okay, let's just close the blueprint editor for the moment and stop to see what we've done. So with the game stopped and under content, your new default pawn blueprint available, note that you can drag it into the world and it's just a copy. It's just a blueprint that of the very pawn that was being spawned because we based it on the existing default pawn. So if we double click it, look up here at the top right, parent class default pawn. Okay, so this is no different to the other default pawn, but the crucial thing is we can change this now. We can actually make changes to the default pawn. So double click. If you get this screen, which is only showing the defaults tab, you can click Open Full Blueprint Editor. And that will then open this, which has the default tabs on the right, but we have various other things. Now, we don't need to worry ourselves about Event Graph or Construction Script windows yet, but in the viewport, you'll see the default pawn, and you'll see that you can manipulate it. You could rescale it, for example, using the R key. And that's exactly what I want you to do now. I want you to try making a rugby ball pawn. Modify the default pawn somehow. As in, not that it's a mystery how, I've just shown you how, but change it somehow. For example, scaling on one axis. Create an instance once you've done that by dragging it into the world. So close the blueprint editor and then drag your default pawn blueprint like I did a moment ago from your content browser and drop it into the world. And see how modifying the instance, so go into your world, modify the thing, the instance of this default pawn you've created, and note that it doesn't change the blueprint. Okay, and then when you finish, just revert whatever change you made to the default pawn. So I know the instructions are not absolutely step by step, and that's on purpose, because how are you going to get any good at manipulating the Unreal Engine if you don't work things out for yourself? So go ahead, pause the video and see if you can make sense of that now. Okay, welcome back. So let's just take a look. Here he is. I'm going to scale up on there. Now, the bit you may have to have noticed is you need to click compile. If you just click save or you just exit, let's try it. Let's see what happens. There it is. There's the default pawn. Let's drag it in. You see the new version that I've just dragged in has not taken on those changes. So I'm going to delete with the delete key. Let's go back to here and see what the minimum we can do is. How about just saving the blueprint? Does that work? Drag it in. Yes, saving the blueprint does. Okay, the reason the blueprint doesn't need to compile is because there's nothing compile-worthy going on. It's just a scale. But in general terms, what you're going to want to do when you edit a blueprint is just click compile, which will also save it, and leave. So I didn't tell you that. Hopefully you discovered it for yourself. There you go. So dragging from default pawn in the content browser into the world makes an instance of that default pawn. There's two of them. Now imagine that I scale one of these guys or rotate it like this. Now we have two instances, right? One's just a rugby ball, one's a rugby ball on its side. But if you look at the default pawn itself, in the viewport, of course it hasn't changed, it hasn't rotated. So the changes do not get written back. There is a way of writing them back from the world, but for now let's keep things simple. I just want you to understand that you change the default pawn here. You can add components to it, which is what we're going to do now. That's going to be super handy. And you can also make various other changes. So first thing I'm going to do is scale back. Okay, so here was my default pawn. I scaled it on the z-axis, and I'm just going to put it back to where it was, like that. Okay, compile and close, and just check by dragging one in that it looks normal again. It does. Cool. Going to get rid of all these weird default pawns in the scene. And now we're going to talk about adding a component. So create yourself a new C++ class called Grabber. But it's an actor component because it's going to go on the pawn, and the pawn is an actor. Okay, it's a reusable component. Just call it Grabber. There it is. So another one of these nice reusable components like our position reporter and various other things that we in the door open script. And let's just let that compile, because until it's compiled we won't be able to actually add it to anything. Well, we may be able to, but let's just let it finish compiling. It doesn't take too long on my machine. So there you go. It's opened up a empty component here with all the boilerplate code that we've seen before. Okay, so back in Unreal we now have a Grabber code here, you see, Grabber C++ under your content browser, C++ classes, and then the name of the game. Crucially, what we can do now is we can go back to content and our default pawn. We can add a component to it, scroll down to custom components, and add the Grabber. Compile, and then just exit. Now, when we drop the default pawn in the scene, there it is, looks very similar, but when you inspect it, it actually will have a Grabber on it. Pretty cool, hey? So this is the reusable object that we are now going to use as a template to replace the one that the game mode inserts when we play. Remember, when we play, currently, if we were to play and then eject immediately, the one that it creates here does not have the Grabber on it, and the one that we put in does have a Grabber component. So what we need to do next is look at changing the blueprint for the game mode, because it is the game mode that determines what the default pawn is. So there you go. Hope that made sense, and I'll see you soon.